So without further ado, I would like to welcome our panelists. We have three faculty with us today from the Department of Human Development and Family Sciences. Marcy Gleason is an associate professor in HDFS, and her research centers on the influence of major life transitions on adults' mental, physical, and relationship health. More specifically, her research explores how close relationships as social contexts influence individuals' ability to cope with both big and small stressors associated with major life transitions. We also have Hannah Williamson, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Human Development and Family Sciences. Hannah's research focuses on strengthening families, particularly among underserved groups, including low-income and ethnic minority groups. She conducts basic and applied studies that examine relationship processes and test various theoretically derived intervention strategies for disadvantaged couples. And then finally, we have Dr. Lisa Neff, who's an associate professor in the Department of Human Development and Family Sciences. Lisa's current research focuses on marital relationships in an effort to understand why, despite the strong feelings of love and commitment that characterize newlywed couples, many marriages end in disappointment. Her research aims to identify the relationship processes associated with positive marital outcomes and to understand how and when stressors external to the relationships, such as work, financial difficulties, etc., hinder couples' efforts to engage in relationship promoting behaviors. So last reminder again to use that Q&A and chat function. And then without further ado, we'll jump into the conversation. So I'm going to start with the obvious question that's on everyone's mind related to relationships at home right now in quarantine. This has been a really stressful time on many different levels. How does stress affect relationships?
Yeah, this is actually a very unique time to be someone who studies stress in relationships. Essentially, a lot of the work that I do comes from the perspective of looking at stress spillover. So there's a lot of research suggesting that when people are coping with stress in life domains that are perhaps outside of their relationship, so things again, like you mentioned, work stress, it could be caring for an aging parent, could be having arguments with friends, maybe in today's day and age, homeschooling your kids, whatever that stressor may be, it can really change family dynamics. And that's because when we're managing a lot of stress, it can lead to increases in anxiety, irritability. It's exhausting, both mentally and physically. And that can carry over into how we interact with our partner. So there's a lot of research showing that when we're experiencing greater levels of stress, we tend to be more likely to engage in negative and conflict behaviors with our partner. So at times when we're stressed, we're more likely to yell at our partner, argue, blame them for problems, and do all those things we know we shouldn't be doing, because it turns out that healthy relationship behaviors, all those things like not snapping back when your partner's a little snippy with you, or learning how to forgive and forget when your partner forgets to do that important favor you asked them to do for you. Those sorts of healthy behaviors can be very difficult to enact. And so if our resources are already drained from our stress, it makes it less likely that we're going to do those good behaviors in those stressful times. That said, there's some research suggesting that the type of stress can have important implications, which is what makes this pandemic so interesting. So there's some research suggesting that when the stress is very uncontrollable and structural, that it might have different effects. To give an example, there's a lot of research showing that financial stress can be hard on couples' relationships. But there was a study done during the Great Recession that showed that if couples blamed the poor economy for their financial troubles, you did not see those stress spillover effects. You saw that they were able to weather that stress fairly well. And I know actually Hannah has some related data on this, more specific to the COVID phenomenon going on now.
Yeah, right. So, what Lisa's talking about what we attribute our partner's behavior to and what we attribute the stress to is kind of how we think about those things and how they go together. So something we call attributions. And so that's something that I've been looking at over the course of the pandemic. So as Lisa mentioned, if there's a lot of different types of stressors, we don't really yet have a really good handle on how every single different type of stressor affects relationships, but they can be acute, they can be chronic, they can be, big, huge life-changing events, they can be small daily hassles, they can be external, they can be internal. And so the way you think about that as particularly, is that this big external stressor that you're kind of weathering together with your partner versus something that maybe a stressor in your life that they possibly contributed to. And so, thinking about things from that external viewpoint is considered more healthy in your relationship, right? So saying my partner, they snapped at me today, well, because we're all, dealing with this big, huge stressor that's weighing on all of us. And that's why they probably did that, and not just because they're a jerk, because they don't care about me, attributing it to something internal about them. And so I have a study that's ongoing right now. So I have a couple data points, and then we're going to continue to follow these people for at least the rest of this year, where I happen to have collected some data from people who are in serious relationships, about 1,000 people back in December for a totally different study. But I happen to have about 1,000 people where we had this sort of baseline. So we know how the relationship was shortly before the pandemic, shortly before things changed around the world. And so then back in March, and again in April, and then actually I just finished a May data collection point also that I haven't looked at yet. I just wrapped that 2 days ago. I went back in and asked them now to report again on those same sorts of things. So how their satisfaction with the relationship, and then also, like I was talking about, attributions. So what are they now if their partner is kind of, being rude or being cold or doing something that's negative for the relationship? What are they attributing it to? And what I found is that these negative attributions have decreased from before to after the pandemic started. So people are now recognizing that this big stressor that's going on is likely a reason for why their partner is behaving in the way that they are. And so they're making fewer maladaptive attributions. And so overall, that's actually a good thing that we're seeing for relationships, for people to consider the external context more when thinking about how to process their partner's behavior.
So is it possible for this unprecedented time to be a positive contributor to a relationship?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Sorry, Lisa, you're about to say something, but what we saw here, I saw a decrease in attribution. So that's one good thing that seems to be happening. And we'll see if that continues over time. Lisa, what did you want to say?
I was just going to note that, there, at least theoretically, there is a possibility for couples to use this time to strengthen the relationship. I just saw some data coming out of a study from some of our colleagues at the University of Georgia, where they were just looking at how people's satisfaction had been affected by the pandemic. And they found that I think it was about 25% of couples reported feeling closer as a result of the pandemic. I'm wondering how many of them had small children in the home. I imagine that might be a factor. But the idea is it can happen. And a reason might be that couples can use this time. Some couples are finding they're spending more time together than perhaps they have in the past because of the shelter in place and more remote working. And it allows for couples to engage in more shared activities together sometimes. So there's a theory in the field known as the theory of emotional capital, which suggests that when couples have the opportunity to engage in small, everyday positive acts together, it doesn't have to be anything crazy, but just simple things like taking a moment to laugh together, having a meal together. These small positive moments can actually accumulate and form sort of an emotional resource for the relationship. So it's called emotional capital because theorists think of it almost as like a bank account for the relationship. So every time you have one of those small positive moments, the idea is you might deposit that moment into your relationship bank account. And that can have a protective effect on the relationship. So when conflict inevitably happens, and it happens in every relationship, the idea is couples who have accumulated more of those shared positive moments together are actually protected from the harmful effects of that conflict when it does arise. It's just the idea, you can think of it as if you're a millionaire and you get a $100 parking ticket, that parking ticket's going to be much less impactful in your life than if you're a struggling grad student who gets that $100 parking ticket. So the more resources you've built up, the less any negativity is going to impact you. And so according to this theory, there are chances, and I've certainly anecdotally seen stories in the news and whatnot of couples who are spending more time together and finding ways to maybe do new leisure activities together, trying to pass the time. And that kind of novelty and new activities can be a boost for the relationship. Not everyone may be experiencing this. It depends on a lot of life circumstances, but it is a possibility.
See, I wonder if you could weigh in on your thoughts of whether or not this could be a positive time for relationships, how, and reliance on partners for that sort of source of, positivity setting.
Yeah, well, I mean, as Lisa and Hannah said, I think it's a possibility. I also think it's a really challenging time for couples because, yes, you have extra time and opportunity to be together, but then, you also have extra time to be together, and that could also lead to more disagreements or not getting along. Plus, there are all of these external stressors coming through it, right? So if you're worried about other people, you may, people yourself catching it, if you have to work outside the home, if you don't have childcare, if you have elderly family, there are so many, and people are losing jobs, losing income, and there's just general uncertainty about what's happening. So when we think about that, it's, yes, you're isolated together, but you are also experiencing a lot of stressors that require support from your partner. Perhaps your partner is the most accessible person in your life. And in fact, other people that you may have been relying on for support in addition to your partner are now less available. Yes, you can Zoom with them, you can talk on the phone, but as wonderful as those things can be, and it does seem in some places people are making new connections, it's really not the same. We're not having the same amount or type of support from our support networks that we are getting probably prior to the pandemic. Now, again, some people might be getting a little bit more through talking to people more online, but that face-to-face conversation, the people you relied on to do different activities that you connected to over different types of activities. So a lot of us, are friends with people at work, and we connect to people through our work. If we don't have that connection with our spouse and we're not seeing our work colleagues, that could be an area where we're really feeling, a lack of connection. And relying on one person for support can be really detrimental, because oftentimes that person can't fulfill all of the areas of our emotional needs and our physical, and our intimacy needs and our, affection needs and all these kind of things. Our romantic partners fill a lot of those, but they don't tend to couples are often fare better when they're not relying on their partner to do all of those things. In addition, people who receive a lot of support tend to report being happier, being healthier. It's really associated with a lot of positivity. But when we actually look at instances of support, when we look at when people actually receive support, it's often associated with more anxiety for the person who's receiving the support. We think that there's a lot of possible reasons for this, but essentially, and a quick way of saying it is that we're not necessarily really good at giving support to people in our lives. We often have a tendency to want to give them the kind of support that we think they need, or that we think will help them by telling them how to do something, or telling them how we would do it, or how they should feel. And that's not a very effective way to provide support for people. It's not typically people more want to be listened to, maybe encouraged. They want to feel understood, and like, you know, and maybe a feeling of shared experience with their partner. But you know, that's not always how those, or often actually, that's not how social support exchanges proceed, right? That, you know, we have these good intentions and we think we're helping our partner, but really we're maybe even making the situation a little bit worse in some cases. And so there's evidence of different ways that we can avoid that. I think one that might feel salient to people right now is this concept of invisible support. So if we can give support to our partners without them being aware of it, that can often be more effective than when they're aware of it. So for instance, with chores, if you're, you know, doing the dishes, or you vacuum the house, or you clean the toilet, it's perhaps going to be more supportive to your partner if you don't announce it to them every time you do that, because that may signal to them that they're, rather than them being like, oh, that's so nice of them to help us out in this way and to be participating, it may signal to them, hey, you didn't clean the toilet, I did, right? And so what are you going to do for me? You know, so sometimes, you know, performing these support acts, even emotional ones, without, you know, making it quite so clear that this is what we're doing, can be a better way of helping our partner. But it's really hard not to get credit for cleaning the toilet. I think we all know that, so.
Yes. You touched on so many things that I feel like resonate with many of us, including how people have different ways of coping with the current times. For some people, staying focused on the positive is really important. For others, venting and having a space where they can sort of air grievances. And sometimes those things are at odds with one another, and that can certainly create unintentional conflict. Speaking of having a sort of disproportionate reliance or interaction on a spouse or a roommate or a partner you live with now, I personally have had the experience of my spouse suddenly becoming my office mate, cubicle mate, and coworker as we lock ourselves in our bedroom to work every day, hidden from our children. And we've laughed many times at the sort of viral tweet and meme that went out about the pro tip for, you know, couples that were suddenly working from home together was to get an imaginary coworker they could blame everything on. Like Cheryl keeps leaving her water cups everywhere. So we talk about Cheryl a lot in our office suite, which is also our bedroom. My question is, if any of y'all have thoughts or there's research related to being sort of instantaneously propelled into a new identity or a new dynamic of a relationship, you know, in addition to being co-parents and spouses, we're now co-workers. And, you know, for many people, the distribution of sort of domestic duties and household responsibilities has also been disrupted, even the role of parenting. There's a lot of co-parenting negotiating that's having to happen. So just thoughts on that, if any of y'all know research you feel like speaks to that or might be relevant to that experience some of us are having.
I mean, there is a theory out there known as relational turbulence theory. And it's one of the things, so Marcy and I also have been conducting some new data collection during this time to look at this idea. So we don't have data specific to the pandemic, but it's a theory that seems really applicable to what's happening right now. It's a theory that talks about how couples navigate transitions. So it's been studied, for instance, in military couples when one partner comes home from deployment and now they're in the same home, they're having to renegotiate roles. And basically, I mean, in a nutshell, as you might expect, it suggests that those periods where couple members are coming together in ways that they hadn't before can be very turbulent and requires a lot of renegotiation of roles within the relationship. And at first, spouses can experience a lot of what they call partner interference. So the idea that your partner is always getting in the way of you accomplishing your day-to-day goals. You had a routine set up, and now your partner's here and they're disrupting that routine. They're, you know, the things you used to do, you can't quite do because of that. And so it can lead to extra conflict, as Marcy was saying. You know, more time isn't always better. It, you know, can be filled with fun, happy moments, but it can also be filled with more tension as you're trying to renegotiate those roles. So, I mean, that's definitely, I haven't seen any data specific to this pandemic, but there is a lot of research looking at those kinds of transitions of couples coming back together and having to renegotiate roles and the extra conflicts that can arise because of it.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay, switching gears a little bit, we are entering as society, as a state, a city, a country, a new stage of this pandemic that's not as clear cut, black and white, as far as what's being recommended, cut and dry shelter in place. There's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of decision making, there's a lot of sort of trade-offs and personal choices that have to be made. What if partners don't agree on how much they should be going out, how much they should be interacting with families, with neighbors, children with other children? Thoughts, research, advice?
Yeah, I think this is another time where, you know, there's the opportunity where this can be a positive thing. It can be an opportunity to connect with your partner. So that would be the advice that I would give here is, you know, as Lisa mentioned earlier, right, conflicts are going to come up. Conflict is inevitable because conflict is just when you and your partner don't want the exact same thing, right? You don't have the exact same goals or needs or desires. And so that's going to happen all the time, that you're not on the exact same page with your partner. And so conflict, you know, has this negative connotation, but it's really, if you have conflicting views with your partner, it's only negative if you handle it in a negative way, right? So when you have conflicting views with your partner, that can be an opportunity for a fight, or that can be an opportunity to learn more about your partner, to connect with them, to set up a conversation, right? Because if they don't agree with you, so you disagree about, you know, something you want to go out and do, or whether you should do that or not, that means they're thinking about it differently, right? They're having different concerns than you. They're having, you know, different experiences than you. And that's a sign then that you need to learn about what those thoughts are that they're having. What experience, you know, are they going through? What is it that they're missing out on, that they're seeking when they want to do that? Or what concerns do they have, right? What fears do they have about, you know, you wanting to go out and do something or something like that? So, so having conflicting viewpoints really is an opportunity for connection, to learn more, to open up and ask questions to your partner to understand where their viewpoint is coming from. So I think if it's handled in that way, where you approach it as an opportunity to listen, right? And as Marcy mentioned earlier, to make sure that your partner feels understood, validated, cared for, respected in the conversation because you're listening to their point of view, then it doesn't have to be a negative thing, right? But that's, of course, if you are actually listening and doing those things, instead of what a lot of people find themselves doing is, as your partner's talking, you're kind of in your mind rehearsing, what is your response going to be? How are you going to combat that thing that they just said? What's your answer to that? Or what's your argument back? Or why are they wrong? Or, okay, what problem solving thing can I do? What's the solution I can offer? And doing a lot of thinking about what you're going to say, rather than just setting that all aside for a minute and actually listening to what your partner's concerns are.
Are there any specific communication strategies that have been found to be effective in productively moving through positive conflict?
Yeah, there's some sort of basic strategies that people can think about and take with them when they want to, you know, have a conversation like this. I would say, you know, first and foremost, we've been talking about all the stuff that's going on, everything that people have going on around them. And so that's really thinking about the setting, right? Before you even get to what are you going to say and how you're going to say it, but do you have an opportunity to even have a you know, a thoughtful, quiet, uninterrupted conversation? That's going to be really hard to come by nowadays. But making sure that you're in a place where you're able to even have that conversation without having something interrupt you or getting stressed out, and you know, having that derail you. One thing that I might suggest that some couples that I've worked with in the past is that actually sitting down to have a conversation feels really kind of scary and weighty, and that's stressful in and of itself, to say like, we're going to have a talk. So people will do something like engage in an activity that you can sort of do while you're talking, right? So do a puzzle, play a game like checkers, something like that, that doesn't require a lot from you, but you're sort of engaged in something else, and then you can chat with your partner while you're doing that, instead of just this, you know, really weighty conversation or something like that. So setting the stage so that you're able to even have this conversation. And then once you're there, like I said, first of all, listening. So being focused less on getting your argument across, less on being right, less on winning the argument, and more on listening and understanding where your partner's coming from, because doing that a lot of times diffuses what you thought was going to be an argument in the first place, right? You understand where they're coming from, you can share where you're coming from, and you actually might have more agreement and less conflict than you even thought. And then focusing on sharing for yourself, right? So it's a sort of a cliche to say use I statements, but if you're saying I, then that's sort of just a little signal that you're talking about yourself. So you're sharing about yourself. I feel worried about whatever it is that you're worried about. So speaking for yourself, not putting words into your partner's mouth or speaking for them, and focusing on, again, sharing your emotions and what you're feeling. And keep in mind too, that a lot of times when we're feeling a negative emotion like fear or worry, anxiety, things like that, when those come out, they come out not as I'm worried about this, but as I'm angry at you for, being irresponsible or something like that. So they come out as this kind of hard emotion when it's really kind of a softer emotion that's underneath that. And so if you can try to spend some time actually connecting with yourself and listening to yourself as well, and figuring out what is the true thing that's going on for you that you can share with your partner, rather than letting it come out as something negative and destructive.
Great, thank you. So we had a question come in asking about impact of stressors related to the pandemic, economic downturn on couples' physical intimacy. And I would love to hear y'all's thoughts on this, if there's preliminary finding, speculation, or other studies, and broaden that actually to ask, we're relatively new into this pandemic. The Great Depression was mentioned, Katrina was mentioned, what are interesting findings about relationships related to extenuating, stressors, maybe of similar scale or near similar scale, both related to physical intimacy, but other sort of findings that maybe from past studies and world events have been found.
Yes, so I'm thinking of a study, it's not on this sort of scale, but there was a study looking at more everyday stressors. So not the pandemic, natural disaster type stressor, but more those everyday hassles that we face. And there is research showing that stress can interfere with physical intimacy in relationships. So in this study, and I think the effect was particularly strong for women compared to men, that on days when women felt particularly stressed, they were less likely to engage in physical intimacy compared to days when they had lower stress levels. In terms of the bigger pandemic, I don't know if either of you know of any data offhand that looks at physical intimacy yet. I know a lot of people are doing studies right now, and so we'll probably have some answers to that in the future.
Yeah, I don't know of any that speak directly to intimacy, but I would say that one thing that we do have information on is that like doing novel and exciting things and learning new things about our partner increases the passion that we feel for our partner, and is linked to increases in sexual intimacy and intimacy generally. So you can think about the beginning of this when we were all of a sudden, panic buying toilet paper and getting ready to, hunker down together, and then hunkering down together, and it all being kind of like new and scary, and that could have been like that could have been a time period where that experience actually could have increased some people's passion for each other and done this. But as Lisa points out, as our research on sort of mundane everyday stressors really suggests that they have a corrosive effect on relationships. And so as this continues, right, where we aren't doing a lot of new things because the things that we can do are limited. We're not even seeing new places. We are seeing the same people and the same walls and the same, like there's a lot of sameness. And again, I don't have any data on this, but that would seem to me to mean that that we would predict that would actually have a real damping effect on people's feelings of passion in general, right? Including with our partner. So trying to find different things to do or different ways to see your partner while in seclusion with them could be really beneficial in that way, right? So like, I know nothing about sexual therapy or anything like that, but it seems like, role playing this may be the time to try that out if it's ever been. Trying to be different can be positive for sexual intimacy. So, but again, this is obviously, well, I hope it's obvious. It's really speculation. We don't have data on it.
Mm-hmm.
We are collecting some data that we might be able to see some differences, but we don't have that comparison before to after. And there is evidence that these stressors sort of have one immediate effect, but then the long-term effects are slightly different, right? Which might speak to some of the hurricane research. Hannah?
Exactly. This idea that something changes, a big change kind of can be positive, going back to what we talked about earlier. So I have another paper that it's not out, it's sort of a preprint, it's under review right now. But looking at couples who lived through Hurricane Harvey, which probably most of you remember, hit the Houston area in August 2017, so just about 3 years ago. And that actually occurred kind of right in the middle of a longitudinal study on newlywed couples. So they had been married for about 1.5 years, 2 years at that point. So we had 3 data points right after they got married, and then spaced out a couple of months later, 3 data points. Hurricane Harvey happened. That was a huge, hugely detrimental storm. It's the second worst that we've had in recorded history after Hurricane Katrina. So this was, a huge stressor again, but very sort of similar, but very different than what we're going through right now. And then we followed those couples again for another about 1.5 years after the hurricane with another 3 data points. And so we're able to look at kind of how the relationship is changing beforehand, and then how does it change afterwards. And what we're finding is that there was a big jump in relationship satisfaction from before to after the hurricane. And so that's how, how happy are you in your relationship? How well do you think you and your partner get along? And how are you supporting each other and things like that? And people are now reporting that they're much happier with their partner and with their relationship after going through this major stressor. And this was actually true even regardless of people who had sort of lower relationship satisfaction going in. They actually had an even bigger jump in their satisfaction. So they were actually, appreciating their partner even more. And so this huge change and this huge disruption does seem like it can sort of reframe the way people are thinking about their relationship, right? Your relationship is now really, even more important than it was before, as far as who you have, who's going through this experience with you, who's going to support you through it. People are recognizing that, other things that before the hurricane hit, all of those sort of day-to-day hassles and things like that, maybe, seem silly now. They don't seem as important. Things that they were annoyed with their partner aren't as important in the bigger picture now, having gone through this major stressor. But then, like Marcy mentioned, we see that then decrease over time. So people increased, but then over that next 1.5 years, they go back down so that they basically end up where they were before the hurricane. So it's kind of this boost that wears off. We don't know exactly why, but we might think that they're just getting back to where they were and back to their normal life, and that experience sort of is leaving their mind. those day-to-day hassles and things come back. Now, you know, the salience of this stressor, of this event that they went through, starts to wear off. So now they're not kind of, as I talked about earlier, attributions. They're maybe not saying, oh, well, you know, this stuff is going on because of this major stressor. Now that's kind of put behind, and now they're not attributing that to anymore. So the stress spillover process that Lisa talked about at the beginning might be happening more. So there's definitely kind of something to be said for where we are right now in the pandemic, where, like Marcy said, things changed very rapidly, you know, about 3 months ago. And now we're in this sort of, you know, habituation phase where things are sort of just staying the same, and it's not novel anymore. And so this is maybe a time when things might start going downhill for people if they weren't already.
Great. So many of you have nibbled at the edges of topics that are speculation at this point, but you have hunches or sort of other study reference or anecdotal evidence to believe they might be playing out in COVID-19. So I am going to ask you all the question of what is a research question you would love to answer related to the pandemic moving forward. But before we get to that, so I'm planting that seed to give you guys a little bit of time to think of your answer. First, I want to talk about how much leeway to give a relationship. So we hear messages of the extreme extenuating circumstances and giving ourselves grace and being realistic. And yet, at what point do you need to address little problems and stressors, because they could turn into bigger problems and bigger stressors? And if there's research or y'all have thoughts on how to balance when to step in and when to give it a pass.
Well, what sort of comes to mind is when you were talking about, you know, Cheryl and her water glasses that she is around your house, is, you know, some of the research, and I think Lisa will speak to this even better, but is that, you know, you kind of, it's the idea of there are different ways in which problems can become problematic, right? There's lots of things that might be small annoyances, and there's evidence that brushing off small annoyances, if you can do that, is good, right? But if what you're really doing is kind of pushing under, like suppressing your annoyance about something that actually really bothers you, not addressing it can worsen the conflict when you do address it, right? Because you're sort of already at a point where you haven't been saying it or discussing it or trying to fix it, but in the person who's upset about its head, they're replaying it, they're thinking about it a lot, and it's coloring other things in the relationship. So I think it's great to joke about, like, truly, I think that having a share able to blame Cheryl is a great thing, right? The thing that I think to some extent we would say be cautious about is if it no longer seems funny, if actually you're really annoyed with Cheryl, right? But what you mean is you're really annoyed with your partner, then it's better to say to your partner, you know, look, I know this isn't a huge thing, like glasses are not the end of the world, but it is driving me crazy, right? And I need you to, you know, to put the glasses in the sink or to do this or this kind of thing. One for me is that I don't want to be asked about what we have to eat. I really, it's such a little thing, but I have banned all members of my household from asking me what there is to eat. I'm like, you are in this house, hasn't changed from the last time we spoke about it. And, you know, there are other little things that people in my household do that can bother me, but that's one that I realized that, like, it was bothering me more and more, right? And so up again and be like, no, remember, I really don't like that question. And like, there are, you know, I think there are topics that are somewhat always big topics, and we're a little bit more aware of what those might be. But Lisa, you probably have better studies to cite for this.
No, I mean, that's a good summary. Yeah, I do have some data looking at the effects of hiding your emotions from your partner, because you know, a lot of times people are afraid to broach a topic of conflict because we have this assumption that conflict is going to be negative. It's going to lead to these, unpleasant experiences. But as Hannah mentioned earlier, it doesn't have to be. And so a lot of times people might choose, I'm just going to hide my emotions so that I don't start a conflict. I just don't want to have a fight right now. The problem is there's research showing that when we suppress our emotions, particularly negative emotions, that it can lead to actually increased rumination about the problem. So even though you're not expressing your emotions, those emotions don't go away. They're just lingering under the surface, and people tend to ruminate about them more, and they tend to build and affect you more. And so we actually had some data looking where we had a daily survey. So we're looking each day, like, did you have a conflict with your partner, or did you, hide feelings from your partner to avoid a conflict? And we found that both strategies felt bad in the same day. So if I hid my feelings, I didn't feel so great about my relationship. If I had a conflict with my partner, I didn't feel so great about my relationship. But having a conflict felt worse in the moment. So on the day it happens, having a conflict felt worse. But now you follow couples up over time, and 6 months later, a year later, and what you see is that couples who more frequently hid their emotions with the goal of trying to avoid a conflict, they reported being much less happy, lower levels of intimacy. They reported increases in their marital problems. People who had conflicts more frequently had none of those increases. So you did not see any adverse effects, which suggests that you can have conflict productively if you, bring up the situation, address it, and move forward.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'd like to end by hearing from each of you what you think is an interesting question to investigate and explore related to the current pandemic. And I'll start with one that I think about often because I live in a sort of near town, small, dense, not a lot of space, open concept floor plan house now, which is an interesting choice given the current circumstances. And I wonder if this is our shift away from the open floor concept, open concept floor plan.
I would really like it to be
I could really use some walls right now. So I'm thinking about how architecture affects space and relationships, and if this is, a new normal is going to emerge on the other side of this, what sort of ripple effects into even how we choose where we dwell and live. And thinking just about how, couples and families in smaller spaces, this might be affecting differently, whether it's New York City or European metropolitan areas versus those with bigger, if there are significant. So that's something I find interesting. I'd love to hear from each of you too. And anyone in the audience, if you have last questions, feel free to submit those as well. So who wants to go first?
Well, I mean, so Lisa and I and a few of our students and another colleague from Southwestern have been have finished collecting daily diaries, a 2-week study of couples looking at their daily behaviors during quarantine. But at the start of that, we were talking about like what we thought would be, possibly exacerbating factors of sort of daily conflict and positivity and negativity. And one of the things that we did ask is, do you have space in your house to be alone? We actually even asked like just how many rooms there are in the house, and whether they have access.
Have a yard?
Yeah, whether you have a yard. The very, very preliminary, like basic correlations that I've run don't suggest any initial effects, but really possibly a moderator as people go through the next 2 weeks, or even if we're able to follow up with them, that might be something that would distinguish. I am in complete agreement with you about, I loved my office because it was my own room in the world prior to this. And I'm in my office for the first time in 3 months or something again, and I love it even more now. But I also still love my family, so
yeah.
really like this office. But I'll let Hannah and Lisa talk about other research questions.
Well, I mean, one thing which we've talked about, and one of the, many reasons, I mean, there's so many questions, and so that's why we're really excited to get some data to look at couples' day-to-day lives during this time. But, as we mentioned, I am interested in the extent to which people are able to blame the pandemic for the troubles and use things like having an imaginary Cheryl and those kinds of strategies. Another topic that we haven't talked about that I've just been fascinated watching the commercials is online dating, because apparently that's still going on during this time. And that's a huge literature looking at how computer-mediated communication influences relationship formation. And given that we're in a period where that is being prolonged, people are not able to meet in person for longer periods of time, suggests that may not be so great for relationship outcomes. So I'm just curious, it'd be curious to see how this is affecting relationship formation processes right now.
Yeah, very interesting.
I was actually thinking about the other end of not relationship formation, but relationship dissolution. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how sort of these processes, these things that are going on within people's homes, between people, are going to interact within what's going on in the broader world, right? So we've been talking about like how people are thinking about and feeling about their relationship, but and thinking about whether this is going to have an effect on divorce rates, for example. Decisions to divorce do take into account these sorts of things of how you're feeling about your partner and how you're interacting with them, but also takes into account, what's going on in the outside world. So what am I going to, if I leave this relationship, what am I entering into? What does my alternative reality look like if I choose to leave this relationship? And right now, going out into the world and starting a new life probably seems kind of scary and difficult, and financially difficult for a lot of people. So we've kind of got this tension between if things are going badly but you're not able to leave, and how that's going to affect what we're going to see happen with divorce rates, and whether they'll be higher or lower after this time.
Yeah. So we have one final question from the audience. Strategies, thoughts, relevant research on introverts getting along with extroverts under the same roof during quarantine, when some need their own time and space alone and others are having a hard time getting it, giving it, etc. Thoughts on this?
I think this is the place where, with the same strategies I talked about earlier would come in, right? So whatever the specific conflict that you have between your partners, here it's an example of different sort of personalities or different needs for interaction or something like that, right? So whatever that conflict is, it's about, letting your partner know what your needs are, right? So if, I don't know if this person is the introvert or the extrovert or which one they are, but telling the partner, like, I need more interaction, or I need less interaction, I need space, I need time away. Not about here's what you're doing that's annoying me, but just about here are what my needs are, here's how I usually fill those, but right now I haven't been able to do that. And so can we talk about what we can do to help me get what I need here, and hopefully help you get what you need too, if your needs aren't being met as well. I don't know if this person knows that their partner also feels that their needs aren't being met or not, but that would be a good first place to start.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for being here, both attendees and faculty visitors, sharing your expertise and your thoughts and your interests on such timely topics. I took furious notes and I can't wait to share them both with my wife and with Cheryl. But again, thank you all for being here. We're very grateful. As a reminder to everyone, if you enjoyed today, or know others who might, check out the rest of the CNS Connect event series. And that's the cue of my dog losing her mind. So without anything else, we're gonna go ahead and wrap up today. Thank you all for being here.